knowledge to data ratio is very small in history. And history repeats itself because nobody learns from it. If somebody is trying to tell something to us, why would they bring up a language that is spoken in a completely different world? That doesn't make any sense to focus on very selected stories to introduce a new way of understanding of all these individual constituent parts, and then you derive the meaning. I'm going to start a series. Jai Shri Ram. My name is Dr. Apaji Panchangam. From today, I'm going to start a series on Sanatana Dharma with emphasis and focus on explaining the hidden, deeper inner meaning of the stories in our Puranas, Itihasas, like Ramayana and Mahabharata. Sometimes also talking about some stories in the Upanishads and in Vedas. Why I chose particularly the stories? It's because growing up, I heard and learned many stories. I read many stories. But all these stories created so many questions. And I asked to resolve those questions. And I did not get any satisfactory answers. As a result, I kind of lost faith in the dharma that I belonged to. For several years, I did not accept the dharma because it was not as rigorous and as logical as the scientific discipline I was studying. But thank to God, and out of my ancestors' good blessings, I found out the actual meanings. And it is not something that I discovered new. It has been there all along in front of us. And many sages, many great masters unlocked these stories and found out great truths and great values and lofty spiritual ideals in them. But somehow they did not make their way into the mainstream Hinduism. So as a result, we have many, many Hindus today that know a bunch of stories but don't know what they mean. They have a lot of questions, but they're stifled when they ask questions. Even the traditional scholarship always recanted the same things over and over without really giving the actual understanding behind these stories. As a result, many Hindus require certain degree of faith to stick on to. A faith meaning something that you believe in that you actually don't know about. But that's not the case. That's not how Sanatana Dharma is, because it is eternal Dharma. Sanatana Dharma means an eternal way. It has no beginning, therefore it has no ending. So such Dharma cannot be simply based on assumptions made by somebody and you blindly believe those assumptions. It has to be based on solid logical foundation. It must match with our experience. Of course, there are many, many things that are beyond the comprehension of human mind and human senses. But yet, to a certain degree, we should be able to verify them and find them to be logical and reasonable and rational. Just by having irrational faith, we cannot promise ourselves that we will be led into the truth. So this series is particularly is giving some of those troubling stories which I picked up. But the listeners, if you have any specific questions and if you post or send those questions to me, or if you want certain aspects of certain stories to be explained, I can do that in a separate series. But within this series, I wanted to focus on very selected stories to introduce a new way of understanding. When I say it is a new way, it is not something that is discovered today by me. It's new way for you, for the listeners, for some of the listeners. But this way is the right way, is the eternal way, and the way that has been there for millennia. But somehow, due to the complacency of the traditional scholarship, negligence of Hindus, and various difficult situations that the society was undergoing in the last several centuries, somehow this method and this outlook has receded into the background as if it doesn't exist at all. The very basic foundation of the approach that I'm going to lay out in understanding and interpreting the stories is directly based in the language of Sanskrit. Sanskrit is said to be Deva Bhasha, and all our Puranas, Itihasas like Mahabharata, Ramayana, and Shruti, that is Vedas, Smrutis, all Dharma Shastras, Puranas, and Kalpa, and all that, they're all written in Sanskrit. So, some degree of Sanskrit understanding would greatly help. But even if you don't, that's okay, because I have lots of students who did not have any Sanskrit background but are able to capture the framework and interpret the stories in their own way for their own personal benefit. This also brings up another question for some of the people, that if I am interpreting the stories in a certain way, is that in alignment with the traditional scholarship? Is that in alignment with the actual teachings and the ultimate truth that is hidden in all in all the Puranas and Itihasas? My answer is, sometimes I might appear to be deviating from the traditional scholarship at the standpoint of the traditionalists, but I promise you, I guarantee you, you can verify it yourself. I'm in total alignment with the tenets of Sanatana Dharma. I am doing this only to match them with the real ideals that were laid out in Sanatana Dharma. And if you don't do it this way, then you will create severe contradictions, and you will find many, many inconsistencies in the stories that are otherwise unresolvable. And therefore, there will be a doubt on the Dharma itself. And therefore, there will be a doubt, and you will lose the trust. It creates what is called ashraddha. Ashraddha means not having trust. So, the purpose of interpreting them to be in alignment with the tenets of the Sanatana Dharma is to emphasize the Shraddha within us. So at the end of the day, the Shraddha is the one that will embark us or enable us to embark on the path of spirituality and remain on it. But otherwise, you will find lots and lots of families. As kids are going to bed, the parents narrate stories of Ramayana and Mahabharata. And as the kids grow out, they might get some questions, or very simply, they lose all kinds of trust and they remain as non practicing Hindus. And the movie makers, they have to invent new ways and put them into different bottles, and to higher and higher degrees of silliness, to show these stories in an entertaining way. At the end of the day, it just becomes some kind of spiritual entertainment. I can't even call it spiritual, but some kind of God based entertainment. But that's not the purpose. The purpose of Sanatana Dharma is to take every human being to realizing the true nature of themselves. That is, they are the Brahman itself. I am the God. I am the Brahman. And the same ideal is what is laid out in Vedas and what is expounded and expanded in all Puranas, Itihasas. And these stories are there to unlock the way, to show the path, to give illustrative examples, to give explanations of all the spiritual principles laid out in Shruti or Vedas. So I'm talking about the Sanskrit. The Bhasha, the language Sanskrit, is called Deva Bhasha, not because there are beings called Devas. Sometimes you see in movies that there are some beings that live in a place called Swarga or a heaven. They wear very expensive clothing, some traditional clothing, very expensive jewelry, and they have some kind of magical powers. And you might think that they have a language that they use in their particular world. Like in our world, we have thousands of languages. Maybe in that world, there is only one language. And that one language is Sanskrit. And that's why it is written in their language, not in our language. But it is trying to teach us. If somebody is trying to tell something to us, why would they bring up a language that is spoken in a completely different world? That doesn't make any sense. That's not what it actually means. The root word for div, for deva, is div. So div means div prakashani, means to shed light. So deva means something that sheds light on something that is hidden, something that is normally unseen. So it sheds light onto it. And that's why it is called Deva Bhasha. A language is constructed in such a way and designed in such a way that it allows you to see deeper layers of hidden meaning by shedding light onto some things that you normally don't pay attention to. And I will give plenty of examples as I'm going through various different episodes of this series. And in each of the stories, I will bring out one by one the framework that the rishis have envisioned and constructed, so that by providing symbolic stories or allegorical stories, they have given a wealth of knowledge, that you can't even imagine. And eventually, I hope that you will all will reach the same place as I am at, that I see this is a great blessing and this is a great boon that was given to me to be born as an adherent of Sanatana Dharma, in Sanatana Dharma. So in Sanskrit, Sanskritam is called Deva Bhasha. Bhasha means language. For the time being, let's say it's a language. But what kind of language is it? It is Deva. That means it sheds light. It inspires deeper understanding of things that we don't normally see, we don't normally get to. And it sheds light onto various deeper aspects of the world that we perceive, that we normally don't pay any attention to. And that's why it is called Dev. From Dev comes Deva. So now I gave one example of how to understand the word Deva. Deva is derived from a root word called Div. So like that, in Sanskrit, there are all the words that you see. They could be verb, they could be nouns, they could be other kinds of words, but they're all derived from verbal roots called dhatus. Dhatu is the root element, and from the root element, you construct a word. For example, we have things called pronouns, and we have nouns, and we have verbs, all that in English. We have all those things in Sanskrit too. But when we talk about names and proper names in English, we really don't ask for the meaning. For example, if you find somebody who is walking in the street and you stop that fellow and ask, "Hey, what's your name?" He says, "Xavier." Then you ask, "What does that mean?" Then he will look up and down and say, "What do you mean what it means?" It's a name. And similarly, we have so many names for cities, for bridges, for places, for roads, for people, so many names. There are proper names and there are just simple names. But how does the language work in English? The language works as, as follows. If you have a name, it is just an arbitrary reference sound that you can utter with your mouth. It's arbitrary. You just chose, like you had a little baby and you decided to name it X13. It's an arbitrary sound that you are uttering through the noun, through the mouth, and you used that as a reference to that particular individual or place or a thing. So in that way, the proper nouns does not deserve to find an inner meaning hidden in them. But that's not how Sanskrit works. In Sanskrit, all the nouns and proper nouns are all derived from verbal roots, the dhatus that I talked about. So when I said Deva, Deva is not the name of a class of beings, as you'd normally understand. And we understand it that way because somehow we have fallen into that rut. But it is indicating a certain property by using a verbal root. The verbal root is div. That means it has an action embedded into it. The action is to shed light, to inspire. So, Deva is something that sheds light onto some things that are in darkness normally, some things that are not seen by us. So, Deva, therefore, although it's a noun, it indicates a certain action. So, similarly, names like Rama, Sita, they are all proper nouns. And we don't ask what Rama means. We don't ask what Sita means. We simply assume that Rama is the name of a person, a man. Sita is the name of a female, a woman. That's how we go. But that's not the right way to look at it. And that's not how rishis have written stuff. And sometimes we also think that the Ramayana, Mahabharata are all historical documents. That's again a totally wrong perspective, in my opinion. Because we know very well that nobody learns from history. And we also know that history has so much of data, the amount of knowledge that anybody gets out of it, actual knowledge, is very little. So the knowledge to data ratio is very small in history. And history repeats itself because nobody learns from it. So all these historical details and data that has been documented and collected is usually useless. Very little of it is useful, but only a few people use it and everybody else forgets it. So that's why rishis never bothered to document historical things accurately. But they have presented, it doesn't mean that they wanted to ignore our history. They presented the history in such a way that it becomes useful to every individual in day-to-day life, in day-to-day living. So therefore, they documented only those historical stories in which there is very high density of knowledge, high density of information. And the way of packaging that is Sanskrit. With Sanskrit, you can package enormous amount of meaning and symbolism in very carefully designed and constructed words. Sanskrit words are constructed from the verbal roots by adding prefixes and suffixes and compounding words, making a big samasa, what they call a compound word. Like that, it is constructed in such a way that the information density is very high. And the construction purpose is to present it in a very palatable, easy to remember way. You might ask, if they are trying to teach some great spiritual truths or spiritual science, why can't they speak in a direct language? Why do they need to tell stories? It's very simple to understand. A story will get into our mind very quickly, stays there for a long time. And the story, if it is constructed properly in the way that I was telling how Sanskrit construct words, the shelf life of the story is very, very long. I'll give you a simple example. If you bring a fruit like a strawberry or something and you leave it outside, it has no protective layer other than a fine skin on top of it. If you keep it outside, it will go rotten in a couple of days. But how about coconut? How is it packaged? And what is its shelf life? Coconut has very long shelf life because it has a hard shell. On top of the shell, it has this fibrous layer, very thick fibrous layer. And when you remove that fibrous layer, the coir or whatever you call, and then you break the shell, then you go to the coconut. So it is packaged in such a way that it can last for a long time. It is built for longer shelf life. So in the same way, the stories were constructed in such a way that the freshness of the message contained in them is not lost, and it can be unraveled and taken by the user anytime, even after 10,000 years, it is not lost. So that's the reason why they're packaged into nice, allegorical, symbolic stories. But the way to open up those stories is by understanding what the word actually means. You have to break down the word to its etymological meaning. So this is called vyutpatti. In Sanskrit, it is called vyutpatti, means etymological meaning. So you break it down to its constituent parts and study the relationship of all these individual constituent parts, and then you derive the meaning. And the meaning is general, very generic meaning, and it tends to be more abstract. So therefore, you also require a storyline so that you can fit that meaning to the storyline and get the right message. And that is the way the Purana, Itihasa stories are constructed. And this is a very, very age old, eternal method expressed in Vedas. And that method is expanded into Puranas and Itihasas. And all great sages, Valmiki, Vyasa, they follow this method. And you require some tools to understand, a framework to understand. And once we understand, then it will become a great problem solving, thrilling experience. And each story will come out with very deep and extremely useful and very practical and very relevant messages. So, with that, I am going to start off this series. And this is just introduction episode, and I'm going to start the next episode with a story of Kashyapa Prajapati and Kashyapa Prajapati's children. See you later.